talk about wilderness in the Bible, it doesn't mean trees, it means the desert. So they're out here in the desert, and they are dying, their lack of food. He's got all his kids and his grandkids looking up to him. So in a way, there's this relief that Jacob can go into Egypt and live off of literally the fat of the land, to live in a nice home, to pass in life and be able to kind of, know that his children and grandchildren are taken care of. And so Jacob is motivated towards this move. And one of the things I think about, especially in chapter 46, is, again, he knew he was going to die. He knew he had this vision that Joseph was going to actually close his eyes. And now he's making this trek. And for someone who is elderly, to make a trip like this can be deadly. Can you imagine being in your 80s, 90s, and having to make a trek on foot in a wagon across unpaved roads for hours and hours with your children and grandchildren? Are we there yet? Can you imagine the frustration? The also needing to stop where there's no wells with water because of the famine. So they are really having to trust that Joseph, when they get there, is going to have their back. If you know anything about the Egyptians, they weren't always trustworthy. They thought for themselves, they took care of themselves. So this was a big step for Egypt to bring in this culture of Hebrews. I will argue it's not just because we love to be able to put a nice little bow on it and say, Pharaoh loved Joseph, and he loved the Hebrews. Well, I love a lot of people, but I'm not sure I want to move 70 people into my backyard forever, And so he's moving these people in, and they have some flocks, they have some property, and so they just kind of come over here into this land that he's going to give them, and they just kind of take over. And so I think probably a part of it is the same motivation that he put Joseph in charge in the first place, and that is monetary value. Somehow between the moment of Jacob and the Israelites coming in now to Egypt and Moses' appearance, which is some 400 years later, they had not only had a great position and a great place to live, but they also, God blessed them in that they were fruitful and they multiplied. And so 400 years in the future, they are no longer talking about how great Joseph was and how he saved everybody. Now it is, who are all these people that have a different language living in our land? And why are they taking up the best land and taking care of the best flocks? And so they end up making them slaves to build. And so they start building property and some of these cities, large cities that they would build. The Hebrews were in charge of that. And they're literally not going out and carving stone, which we know they had the ability to do if you've ever seen the pyramids of Giza, which are in the background of this picture. They had the ability to build some large structures, has great technology. But what they did was they said, we could go out and cut stone and bring it in, but we're going to make these Israelites make bricks. So I don't know if you have any experience with this, but it takes time and it takes patience, and you have to have the right mixture. And what we'll see in the story of Moses is that Pharaoh gets so angry with these Israelites, he kills some of them, and then when Moses is trying to get them out, makes them make the bricks without straw. So there's nothing in there to harden it. If you've ever made concrete before to pour a slab or something like that, sometimes it's good to have a little grit in there, a little gravel, something to have some structure to it. You're not waiting on it to bake into this clay or this, like we would say with concrete, this structure to be able to build on. And so they're literally having to make these bricks and lay them out so that they harden in the sun. And they're doing it with very primitive tools. So it was certainly we would say much like a prison camp type thing, where their hard labor is what they were doing. Though they were in the land and they had been a blessing, now they see them as a curse, which makes it all the more ironic that Pharaoh doesn't let them go. You'd think that he'd want them out, but he realizes that he's lost his slave labor when they leave, and he goes after them and chases them down. So in chapter 46, Jacob is motivated to this move. They take everything with them. Remember that they sent the finest wagons. We read that last time. They brought the finest wagons. And so this caravan comes into Egypt in the midst of this famine and all the king's chariots. And the 2 chapters before tells us that the Egyptians actually hated the Hebrews. And they didn't really eat with Joseph because he was a Hebrew. They knew his story. But when you continue to see these 70 descendants of Jacob come in, they get treated like royalty. and they had a value to the Egyptians. Look in, let's back up just a minute to Genesis 46, and I want to read just a few verses with you. We'll look at verses 28 through 34. Genesis 28 through 34. 46, sorry. Genesis 46, beginning at verse 28. So it says, Then he sent Judah before him to Joseph to point out before him the way to Goshen, which is the land that they had been given. And they came to the land of Goshen, so Joseph made ready his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel. And he presented himself to him and fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while. And Israel said to Joseph, Now let me die, since I have seen your face, because you're still alive. Then Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and tell Pharaoh and say to him, My brothers and those of my father's house who are in the land of Canaan have come to me, and men are shepherds, for their occupation has been to feed livestock, and they have brought their flocks, their herds, and all that they have. So it shall be when Pharaoh calls you and says, What is your occupation? That you should say, Your servants' occupation has been with livestock from our youth even until now, both we and also our fathers, that you may dwell in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. So you have a double whammy in a way. The Egyptians thought themselves above this kind of a job. So Joseph says, I have the perfect place and the perfect role. And he says, when Pharaoh asks, or the Pharaoh's leaders ask, what are you here for? You just say, hey, we're your servants. We're just here to shepherd. And it also proves that they need to have jobs available. To be able to receive food or wages, they're moving into a city that is a place where they gathered crops, they gathered the grain into these barns, and so these silos, we would say, with all the food, they're actually in those cities. But to not give the impression that they're there to get all the food, have you ever had that moment where you're fixing food and you realize you don't have enough for everybody? Well, they have very little grain. These last 7 years of famine are really worse than anything they experienced before. And so Joseph has done everything he can to calculate how to protect the family. He doesn't want them to be hated any more than they already are. So he says, hey, just take a lowly position, stay outside of the main capital city, and you're going to be taken care of. And so Joseph has really thought this through. And they settle in the land of Goshen. They volunteer for this job. They say, hey, this is what we do. And so Jacob is, at this point, really excited just to be there. He says, I just wish now I could just die. So then we go to chapter 47, and Joseph now has to learn to manage the chaos. Everybody loves you when things are going good. I mean, when things are great, everybody's happy, and there's no stress. It's great. But whenever there are problems, there begins this, dissension in the ranks. There becomes people getting frustrated, upset, and maybe a little bit of animosity could come. And so Joseph is trying to manage all of these provisions. It was his idea. And so when they hand out the food, it's not like they're going and getting bags. They're still receiving rations, which are fairly small. Those of you who've done mission work in foreign countries, I have a picture somewhere of a ration card that one of our preachers had in Cuba, and they have on it, you can have like a bag of rice, this, except for bread. Bread's free and anybody can have it. That's taught to them when they were children. But they have all these things, rations. They can only have so many cups of this and so many cups of that. So if you have a big feast and you run out of food, there's nothing for your family. And so you have this limited amount. And so more than likely, as they get these provisions, the people already are fighting for food. In a way, they may be fighting for land. Joseph says to his family, here's what I'm going to say, here's what you're going to say, and everything's going to be okay. And I love Jacob. He's just like, I'm an old man. I just want to die in peace. But Pharaoh gives them the land. If you've got a map, and I don't have a picture on here, if you look at the Egyptian map, it's near the city of Ramses. So again, one of these major cities where the people would have trekked to get food. And it was one of the two cities where the storehouses were located. And so they're outside of this storehouse city in a place where the animals were kept. Now, one more thing before we move forward. Remember earlier, one of Joseph's requests was if people don't have enough money to buy grain, why don't we buy their animals from them and then they can have the grain? And so the animals belong to Pharaoh. Y'all with me? The land belonged to Pharaoh, the animals belonged to Pharaoh, the houses belonged to Pharaoh, the people belonged to Pharaoh. What's the difference with these Israelites? They're coming in with their own livestock. So they already have, so Joseph's trying to work this out where it's easy, but they have an upper hand because these aren't Pharaoh's sheep. These aren't Pharaoh's cattle. These belong to the Israelites. And so putting them on the outside of one of these storehouse cities, it may be that they were avoided, but it also could be that as they're making their way to town, they see these animals and these foreigners sitting out there grazing, and may have thought, how did they get such prime land, and how are they able to keep their animals for themselves? And it's because of Joseph's provision and because the king or Pharaoh permitted it. But they find protection. If you will mark here the land of Goshen, when you get to Exodus, say, chapter 2 and 3, you will see that these people in these cities, again, they were once storehouse cities, now become cities to make bricks for building. Later on, when the plagues happen, God puts a barrier between most of Egypt and this city because he protected the Israelites. And I'm not trying to jump ahead because we're not going to be studying Exodus next, but I'm telling you, if you'll read Exodus, you'll see that God puts this force field between the cities. And literally, it's almost like when the darkness happens, when some of the plagues happen, they're out there with their sheep and their cattle and grazing and making their bricks and stuff, and there's this wall where they didn't come through. You could not make it through that. God protected his people from those plagues. Until we get to the one of the death of the firstborn, and then God basically removes that and says, every one of you are going to have to cover your house. So they take the hyssop and put blood above the doorposts. So when things get really bad in Egypt and people get frustrated, Joseph's trying to make sure that they know what to say, how to say. They're not living in a wealthy land because the money pretty much had all gone to Pharaoh. But it was a choice part of the territory. And they now are protecting the crops and the sheep and the cattle of the king. And this, believe it or not, as sad as it sounds, is the Fertile Crescent. This is where they should have had the greatest crops. I've mentioned before, I find it hard. I don't know who else does, but I know I think differently than most people. But if I lived in a desert, I don't care if it was great-great-great-great-grandpa's land. I'm not going to stay because there's no food, right? There's no food out there. I don't know who would want to. We see all these commercials and we're raising money and sending food over there. And the only survival they have is us taking them food because they won't leave. Really, it'd probably be better to provide U-Hauls, and buses to get out. But they love their land so much they refuse to leave. And this was at one time the Fertile Crescent. Well, it's been thousands of years. I don't care how beautiful the Nile used to be, it doesn't look the same today. And it really starts, there are some seasons in the time of the life of, say, David and Solomon where it got a little bit better, but mostly it was a culturally rich city, not a necessarily economically rich city. And if it wasn't because they had bukus of crops. They're not out there planting rows and rows and rows of crops. So the water, pretty much, they have to bring in from the Nile or little creeks and wells that they could have near to that place. But at one time, it was basically just a little bit to the right. If you're looking at your map of it, which would be the east side, there would have been much there. It would have been like it was originally the Garden of Eden. So Jacob finds peace in his old age, and then chapter 48 is when he decides to magnify the multitude. He wants to take all of his kids and put them at his feet and encourage them. So let's read together, beginning of verse 1. Now it came to pass after these things that Joseph was told, indeed your father is sick, and he took with him his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And Jacob was told, look, your son Joseph is coming to you. And Israel strengthened himself and sat up on the bed. And then Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me. And he said to me, behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you and make you a multitude of people and give this land to your descendants after you go as an everlasting possession. And now you, your two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, are mine, as Reuben and Simeon shall be mine. Your offspring, whom you beget after them, shall be yours. They shall be called by my name, of their brothers in their inheritance. But as for me, when I came from Padan, Rachel died beside me in the land of Canaan on the way. And when there was but a little distance to go to Ephrath, I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. And Israel saw Joseph's sons and said, "Who are these?" So his eyesight's poor. Interesting enough how history repeats itself, just like his daddy looked at his two sons. Now here he is, his eyesight, and he's looking at his two sons. Joseph says to his father, "These are my sons, whom God has given me in this place." And he said, "Please bring them to me, and I'll bless them." Now the eyes of Israel were dim with age, so that he could not see. And then Joseph brought them near him, and he kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, I had not thought to see your face, but in fact God has also shown me your offspring." So Joseph brought them from beside his knees, and he bowed down with his face to the earth. And Joseph took both of them, Ephraim with his right hand toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh with his left hand towards Israel's right hand, and he brought them near him. And Israel stretched out his hand, his right hand, laid it on Ephraim's head, who was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, guiding his hands knowingly, for Manasseh was the firstborn. And he blessed Joseph and said, "God, before whom my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, walked, the God who has fed me all my life, long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads. Let my name be upon them, and the name of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth." Now when Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on Ephraim, it displeased him. So he took a hold of his father's hand and removed it, and from that he put Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, "Not so, my father, for this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head." But his father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations." So he blessed them that day, saying, "By you Israel will bless, saying, may God make you as Ephraim and Manasseh." And thus he set Ephraim before Manasseh. And then Israel said to Joseph, "Behold, I am dying, but God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to you one portion above your brothers, which I took from the hand of the Amorite with my sword and my bow." So he, in this moment, has blessed his sons. He now is blessing his grandsons. He's making a vow to take care of them. I do think it's interesting, two things real quickly, that he chooses to bless Ephraim and Manasseh before Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, and the rest. These are basically what would be considered his. He says, "Joseph, they're going to be my kids. I want you to pretend like they're mine. I'm going to give you a double portion." This is providence in action. We have no idea about the law of Moses. This is 400 years prior. We have no idea about how the seed promise is going to continue through Jacob's descendants. We have no idea how all that's going to work out. We're just reading the first book of the Bible. But what God is doing is allowing Jacob, who by a vision already knows what to do, God's already talked to him about it. He's giving a blessing to the two boys, which would basically be like his two youngest. And he's putting his hands on them and blessing them first. So if you're sitting at the table and there's 12 table settings, and you've got 12 kids, and you just gave one kid 2 portions, what does that mean? Somebody's not going to have a seat at the table, right? Somebody's got to sit at the kiddie table where these 2 little kiddies belong. Well, what God is doing is he's showing us that in 400 plus years, when Moses goes to Mount Sinai and receives the law, God is going to say this was all part of his plan. Levi, who would become part of the building of the holy priesthood, would receive a portion, but it would be from all of them together. And when they would bring their offering, their sacrifices, and this is another reason why we need to read our Old Testament. There's so much rich history about why Jesus died for all and the importance of animal sacrifice, is they would bring their sacrifices and lay it on the altar, and there were certain portions of the meat, the best parts often, would be eaten by the Levites. And so you say, well, how did the Levites survive? They didn't have any land. They didn't have a lot of riches. They didn't really have a lot of money. They were provided for by the temple or the tabernacle at that time when Moses comes along. And so they would come and they would eat. So I tell you, we would probably, I know I would have a hard time as a Levite because of the sacrificing of critters. But if we're talking about barbecue, y'all with me? Every time, I'm all right with that. I don't need a rich house. I don't need all these things. But if I'm guaranteed good food, I'm just fine. And so the Levites were given that great portion. So they didn't have land when they divide the land. They didn't have inheritance as they divided the inheritance. They're going to get the sacrifices. But for 400 years, there's that question. Why did God give to this handful of people and not to Levi? And that's why. But Joseph watches his dad bless his sons. He's a little confused. I think it's interesting when he takes his hand and moves it. Joseph had also had a problem as a young brother. His brothers didn't look up to him. His brothers didn't respect him. They saw him as just this punk kid that was a tattletale. And so now Joseph is already a little nervous, and we'll see that in the next chapter. And Jacob is going to have to try to pronounce this blessing on them. So when Reuben and Simeon and Levi and everybody come to the table in chapter 49, how come these two boys already have a seat? How come their inheritance has already been given? Because ultimately, Joseph is the one who saved them. And it's out of respect that Jacob gives the first provisions of blessings to them. It doesn't mean they have the birthright. That's going to come through Judah. But they did get recognized first, which was uncommon when you're talking about Hebrew blessings. It always started with the oldest. Does that make sense? And so now in chapter 49, he blesses Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Zebulun, Issachar, Dan, Asher, and Naphtali. And then he talks about Joseph briefly in verses 22 and 26. He blesses Benjamin, and then he offers his final words. I know there's a lot of ground to cover, and we got 10 minutes, so I'm going to skip through and get down to the end. So if you'll get down to 28, let's meet there and read together. It says, all these, the 12 tribes of Israel, this is chapter 49, verse 28. All these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is what their father spoke to them, and he blessed each one according to his own blessing. And then he charged them and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the land of Ephron the Hittite, and the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought the field from Ephron the Hittite as a possession for the burial place. And there they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife. And there I buried Leah. Remember, Rachel, he'd said previously, died on the way. They had to bury her in Bethel. So I buried Leah there. And the cave, verse 32, that is there were purchased from the sons of Heth. And when Jacob had finished commanding his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. Chapter 50 says, then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father, which again, a practice of Egyptians. You've seen mummies, you know how they do it. The Egyptians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for him, for such are the days required for those who are embalmed. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. Now when the days of his mourning were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, if now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the hearing of Pharaoh, saying, my father made me swear, saying, behold, I am dying, and my grave, which I dug for myself, is in the land of Canaan, there she should bury me. Now therefore, please let me go up and bury my father, and I will come back. And Pharaoh said, get up, bury your father, as he made you swear. So Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his house, the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the houses of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's house. Only their little ones, their flocks and their herds, they left in Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great gathering. And then they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, and they mourned there with a great and very solemn lamentation. He observed 7 days of mourning for his father. That's in this one location. In verse 11, and when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, this is a deep mourning of the Egyptians, because again, there's so many Egyptians there. Therefore, its name was called Abel Mizraim. which is beyond the Jordan. So his sons did for him just as he had commanded them. And they take him, they bury him in the cave of Machpelah. It's a beautiful, beautiful ceremony. Probably more Egyptians there than there were of the Hebrews. And they actually changed the name of the town because they said, we've never seen anything like this. Egyptians coming out in the desert to wail and mourn for a guy that is a Hebrew. And so in this blessing that he offers and breathing his last, he tells them, I need you to mourn me, but I don't want to be buried here in this foreign land. Now, what happens for the next 400 years? Well, they're all going to be buried in Egypt or near to Egypt. Joseph's the only one, and we see that in the last chapter where he says, when I die, I need you to carry me out much like you did my father. And I think that's probably one of the craziest things of a visual aid that you could ever see in Scripture. But let's look again here from the mourning. There's mourning, but there's also meddling a little bit. The first 14 verses are this sad scene. But then the brothers start to question, is Jacob's death going to cause Joseph to rethink the way he treats his brothers? And so, well, why would they think that? Come on now. Anybody in here have a brother or sister? You know, mom and dad leave the house. Or you go out in public, don't mess with your brother. Don't mess with your sister. Be on your best behavior. Well, when you're around them, you might get thumped. In my day, the parents not only whipped you, the people that you were with could whip you, You're at somebody's house, they could get a hold of you. Well, here, the brothers have got along while dad's alive, but what happens when dad dies? Is Joseph going to go, this was all part of my plan. I got you here, I'm going to torture you for however many years. So they start to meddle. They start to worry that the promise Joseph made to them, that he felt like God was helping him through the whole thing, might change the way that they treat each other. So in verse 15, they come to him, and it says they saw their father was dead and said, perhaps Joseph will hate us and may actually repay us for all the evil which we've done to him. So they sent messengers. They love that. You ever had somebody, they come to you and say, hey, somebody wanted me to tell you or ask you. So they don't even have the audacity to go and ask themselves. They send somebody else. Would you go ask Joseph if he's still mad at us? Before your father died, he commanded, saying, thus you shall say to Joseph, I beg you, please forgive the trespass of your brothers and their sins, for they did evil to you. I don't know that that's true. I'm not saying that it's a lie. But it's always easy, when you are going through something and you turn to your brother or sister and go, hey, mom said you had to be nice. Dad said you couldn't hurt me. You're not allowed to hit me anymore. Don't call me that name. And so they say, well, we talked to Dad about this. And again, they're not there to give the message. We talked to Dad about this, and he told us that when he was gone, we needed to come and make sure that you were still good with your promise. And you would think that in this moment, Joseph might go, are you kidding me? Oh, yeah, we're fine, we're good. But that's not the way he takes it. It says, now please forgive the trespass of the servants of the God of your father. And Joseph, it says, verse 17 at the very end, wept. He wept when they said that. Your brothers have sent us this message. You need to take good care of each other, and you need to love each other. You promised your dad you would. And he cries because it's very hard when you've had to forgive someone. You say, hey, forgive me for what I've done, and there's this back and forth. Sometimes it's easier to ask for forgiveness than it is to receive the forgiveness. It just depends on the situation. But in this moment, he realizes, he's told them, we're good. Everything's good. But they did not believe Joseph. They did not believe, for whatever reason, that he was going to keep his promise. Now, the boys are getting older too. Joseph's going to die in the same chapter. But the boys are getting older, and they're worried about their grandkids. Now, why would they be so scared about Joseph? I'll give you my thoughts on this. What did Jacob do before he blessed Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah? What did he do? He blessed Joseph's kids, right? So we oftentimes will invent trouble. We think the worst case scenario. You ever had a conversation with someone and you said, man, this is going to be terrible. I'm so worked up about it. I'm so scared to say something. And then you get it out and you're like, man, that wasn't as bad as we thought. Yeah, that's the way it is. You kind of go, well, maybe if we just talked about it as brothers. And so they have processed in their mind, Ephraim and Manasseh were blessed first. So what if they are the patriarchs of the family, What if those young boys end up being the leaders? So their confusion, it causes Joseph to cry. Verse 18, he told his brothers, he went in and fell down before his face, and they said, behold, we are your servants. So the brothers now, they've got the message to Joseph. Now they're weeping before him. Please forgive us, please forgive us. And Joseph says, verse 19, do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. If you've got a pen or a highlighter, you need to underline that. Sometimes you think the storm that you're in is the worst case scenario, and God says, no, that was the best option we had. That was the best option. The storm you went through, that was the best. Joseph in prison and in chains and in pits and everything we've dealt with to this point, God says that was the best option, Joseph. What was the other option? Death at the hands of his brothers. God preserved him in the pit. He preserved him in the prison. He preserved him in the palace. And now beyond. And so he says, God did all this. And I have to say, the admiration that I have for Joseph is unmatched. I don't think there's another story in Scripture that shows this kind of forgiveness until we see Jesus in the New Testament. That's willing to comprehensively forgive, and when he has the power to do whatever he wants to them. He could say whatever he wants, he can do whatever he wants, he can have them sent back to Egypt on a rail if he wanted, but he doesn't. So his love for his brothers, this forgiveness that he offers is a kind of this milestone I think we all ought to be looking at. How can I forgive like Joseph did? How can I appreciate that? Yeah, Lewis?
An example of Joseph could possibly be an analogy for Christ. And many times we as Christians, when we look up and we say, well, I don't know whether I'm going to heaven or not.
Right.
You know, Joseph crying in that instance is basically like Joseph crying when his brothers had such doubt about whether he had forgiven them.
Yeah.
And you know, here after baptism, we're forgiven. But sometimes it's really hard for us to comprehend that forgiveness.
Right. Yeah, we're not really used to a clean slate. Because we still hold the memory of it. We have the consequences of our sin. So a clean slate sounds really good, but it's very hard for us to do that because we still remember what we did. It's also hard to look at people in the eye when you've hurt them or they've hurt you. But that's the picture, as Lewis said, of Jesus, that he can look down off the cross and say, Lord, they don't understand what they're doing down here. You're going to have to forgive them. I know what they did. I know they nailed me here. I know this is all part of your plan, but please don't hold this on their account. Same thing with Stephen when he's stoned to death. That the beauty of being able to forgive in the moment when you don't have to, right? Even this is before the old law, but there were laws on the books, even Egyptian laws, where punishment could be rendered for such things. I mean, they tortured this poor kid, and he has all the power to do whatever he wants. And he says, it's okay. We're going to work through it. We're going to make it work. Did you have your hand up, Jason? I think it's such a great picture of the way we have resolution in conflict, is that we constantly talk through our struggles and we make sure everything's in a good place. We hold each other accountable and stuff like that, but we are at a place where we can be honest with each other. And the brothers were a little nervous. It hurts Joseph's heart, but he also knows that his reassurance is the only thing that can help. And sometimes reminding people that they're forgiven is a good thing. You know, we're good, right? This is okay. We're past that. Please don't remember that anymore. I've let it go. And we've lived long enough to know that it often comes up in arguments, especially with our spouse. Something happens and we're like, oh, yeah. Well, you remember when you did such and such the other day, you know? And, you know, I think sometimes as we get older, some things in our memory disappears, but for some things, they don't, you know? Back in 1984... do you remember when you didn't mow the grass when I told you to? You know, and so we bring up all that, drudge up all that mess that happened before, and that's not what Joseph does. Joseph says, we're good, guys. Just please let it go. You don't need to worry about it anymore. Beautiful picture of forgiveness. Very sad. Now, then you get to, we already passed time. Can I have 2 minutes? I'm asking. Here, I got the pulpit. I don't have 2 minutes. I have 1 minute. 10, I'll take 90 seconds. The end of the story is really fascinating in that Joseph is now getting ready for death himself. And so now he's got his sons there, he's got some of the brothers there and family members. And he tells them, basically, here's what I need you to do. When I die, I need you to mummify my body, and I need you to keep me as a keepsake for 400 years, right? Now, this is one thing if you know the guy, right? I personally, I'm so glad of our customs. We usually do cremation or a burial. We don't usually mummify Grandpa and prop him in the corner for 400 years. Y'all with me? It's like, who's that over there? What's that? What do we got over there in that box, Daddy? Well, that's the 400-year-old rotting corpse of your great uncle. And so why in the world would Joseph say, mummify me, set me aside? Because he says, when you leave here, in other words, you're not going to be here forever. When you leave here, I want you to take my body with you. I want to be buried in the land that God has promised us. So Joseph's, as disgusting as it is, as crazy as it is, when they leave Egypt, they've got some of the golden stuff. I'm ahead of myself, but they get all the golden stuff. They leave Egypt. And they're walking out with carts, and they're walking out with food, and they're walking out with this, giant corpse. I mean, can you imagine? And they walk through the desert with this corpse for years before they bury him. He's just kind of walking around. I think I've told the story, my favorite story of my youth. We had a big blizzard one year, and we didn't have any sleds. And so we had a friend, her dad owned the Preston Marsh Funeral Home. And we went down there, and he had a coffin lid. And we said, man, that's perfect. Little Pam, let's just go hit the slopes. And we walked around town all day with a coffin lid. Skiing. I wish somebody had taken a picture of us. But you can imagine walking around with a corpse through the wilderness. It's your time to carry Uncle Joseph. Well, I had him last time. So you're carrying around this full-sized, mummified body for years, and you propped him up, you put him in a place. It's like, don't forget Joseph. When we leave here, you got to take great-great-great-great-grandpa Joseph's bones with him. But it was a sign to them, you're going to leave. And when you leave, take my bones with you. And that's a beautiful picture of him knowing and having a providence that God's going to provide safety for them 400 years later in the story of Exodus. And if you want to know what happens next, keep reading, and you'll see what happens to the Israelites. All right, time is up. Anybody got any comments or thoughts, questions, complaints, criticisms? All right, so that's all until Wednesday morning, 10 o'clock, and Wednesday night, 6:30. Thank you all so much for being here. Let's have a good week.